Shalom. So welcome back to our study that we're calling it What's Up with Galatians. But of course, at this point we went past Galatians and we're looking at other incidents that occurred within the early assembly, incidents between Paul and Kepha, which eventually led into this seeming rift between James and Paul, and it continues to manifest itself in Paul's letters. So, as a brief review, in part 1, we saw that Paul wrote Galatians as a response to an incident where he had a disagreement with Kepha. Now, we don't know what the incident was specifically, but whatever it was, it caused a division between Paul and the rest of the early believers. The evidence seems to indicate that the issue was exposed by John Mark, who was likely a member of Yeshua's family, and that Paul was on one side of this issue and virtually everyone else was on the opposite. And then in the last video, part 2, we saw that the Epistle of James was likely a response to the letter of Galatians. And even if it wasn't for Galatians specifically, you see a lot of the same language used in the book of Romans, so it could have been a response to both Galatians and Romans. But it does seem to kind of line up with a lot of the statements made in Galatians. James had obvious differences of theology with Paul, as did the rest of the Jerusalem assembly, and the people that Paul was highly critical of in Galatians were all members of Yeshua's family, an inner circle of believers. So the party that Paul had this problem with was the apostles themselves. I don't think... Now, Paul goes at great lengths to try and not come right out and say that. He doesn't specifically name names for the most part, but if you do a little bit of reading between the lines, it's pretty easy to figure out who his opposition is. So before we get started on this one, let's talk a little bit about what the doctrines of James were. And this is coming from a book by Epiphanius, written in the 4th century, that goes into some of these Jewish Christian groups. And they all seem to have pretty much the same doctrines. I'm sure that there was some differences between these groups by the 4th century, but the way Epiphanius describes them, it's really difficult to tell a lot of these groups apart. But in chapter 18, in the chapter where Epiphanius is speaking about the Nazareans, he says, "Next I shall undertake to describe the sect of the Hemero Baptists," which essentially is just a daily bathing, daily baptizing sect, called the sect of the Nazareans. This sect practices Judaism in all respects and have scarcely any beliefs beyond the ones that I have mentioned. It too had been given circumcision, kept the Sabbath, observed the festivals, and did not inculcate fate or astrology. So, this is, in a lot of ways, this is kind of what most of the Messianic Jewish movement or the Hebraic roots movement, this is kind of what they see the Nazareans as being. However, if you do go a little bit further, now this is kind of what would be controversial to, especially to these modern groups that believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, because the Nazarenes also believed that the Pentateuch itself had been corrupted, and so Moses was given legislation, but the legislation itself was not necessarily the first 5 books of the Bible. And so one of the things that they disagreed with is that they would not sacrifice or eat meat, because in their eyes it was unlawful to eat meat or to make sacrifices with it. And believe it or not, this is something that we also see espoused by most of these Jewish Christian groups, is that they understood that the Torah had been corrupted over time. And you see it all through the prophets also. Jeremiah talks about the lying pen of the scribes, and virtually all the prophets in the Old Testament at one point or another, they condemn the animal sacrifices repeatedly, over and over and over again. And there are videos on my channel that go into that. You can look up, I did a couple of videos on I came to abolish sacrifices. You can look at that. It talks about the prophets and the way that they all seem to be against sacrifices. And so you see that same belief brought forth by the Nazareans. So after Acts 15 is where you see this rift between Barnabas and Paul, which also involved John Mark, which seemed to line up with what happened in Galatians. The rift occurred at Antioch, which again lines up with Galatians. So Acts 15 is generally where we think Galatians occurred. This is where Peter and Paul had the argument. And so immediately after that, Paul goes on what is known as the second missionary journey. And here in this map, you can see the route kind of mapped out, where he goes through Asia and up into Greece. And so that's his second missionary journey. He comes back to Jerusalem. This is the one where he wouldn't stop at Ephesus because he wanted to get back to Jerusalem in time for the feast. But we don't really have any information about him going to Jerusalem. It just it doesn't even say that he went to Jerusalem. It says he went to Caesarea and then went up and then went down to Antioch. And so when it says he went up, we generally think that meant he went to Jerusalem, but we don't have any details at all about this trip to Jerusalem. And then he goes on what is known as the third missionary journey. And you can see the arrow there pointing to the Grecian peninsula, and it's pointing to Corinth, because Corinth is where Paul spent a great deal of time on this third missionary journey, and is probably where he was when he wrote the book of Romans. So we're going to look at the letter to the Romans, and we're just going to look at it briefly and compare it to Acts. So one of the reasons people think that it was written in Corinth is because of some of the names in it. We can see that it was written after the second missionary journey, because in Romans 16 he mentions Priscilla and Aquilus, and in Acts 18:1, during the second missionary journey, is where he met Aquilus and Priscilla. And so this was right before he went back to Caesarea and then down to Jerusalem. So that kind of gives us a time frame of where it couldn't have been any earlier than this. And so then in Acts 20, he ends up going to Greece, and he is there. You notice that some of the names that are mentioned at the end of the book of Romans, the people that he's mentioning are with him when he's writing Romans. The names are either the same or very similar to some of the names that are mentioned in the book of Acts when he was there in Corinth. So in the book of Romans here, chapter 15, he's mentioning that he's planning to go to Jerusalem to meet with the set apart ones, or the holy ones, which is probably speaking about the apostles. So there's this weird thing going on in Paul's epistles where he will criticize or condemn the apostles, but yet he still kind of refers to them as the holy ones. And I really think that Paul didn't like them, especially James. I think that he had a definite chip in his shoulder with regards to James, and I think he saw James as kind of being a thorn in his side. That may even be the thorn in his flesh that Paul speaks about, that Paul calls the servant of Satan. I think it could very well possibly be James. But so, at one point he says something like this, where he's referring to the apostles respectfully, And like I said, I think he does that because he has to maintain some level of credibility, but then at times I also believe his emotions get the best of him, and he starts kind of ranting about them, but he won't name them by names. He just names them as these people that are harassing him. So notice here he says he's asking for the people in Rome to pray for him so that he might be delivered from those in Yehuda who do not believe, and that my service for Jerusalem be well received by the set apart ones. Now, when we read this, we think that we're talking about Jews who don't believe. But I'm not necessarily sure that's it. I think that Paul had his own Messiah that he taught, his own doctrine in Messiah, and that the Jews, even the Jewish Christians, did not believe in Paul's version or Paul's theology. So, Romans 14:1. Remember we said that one of the beliefs of the Nazareans was that they did not eat meat. They did not believe that sacrifices were ordained by the Almighty. Now Paul, despite the fact that he claims to be a Pharisee, he admits that he was an agent of the high priest. We see that in the book of Acts, where he was going out by order of the high priest to harass the early believers. And the high priest, of course, was a Sadducee. He seems to be more of a Sadducean type of person and not a Pharisee. He doesn't behave like a Pharisee. He doesn't write like a Pharisee. He doesn't quote any of the Pharisaical, rabbis or leaders or teachers. But yet he does quote a great deal of pagan authors and pagan philosophers. But he doesn't quote any rabbis. So, Romans 14:1, he says, and receive him who is weak in belief, not criticizing his thoughts. One indeed believes to eat all food, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Now, is this really what we think of people who eat only vegetables? I mean, in today's society, at least, we think of those people as being strong. The people that have that self-discipline to be vegans or vegetarians, they're not generally looked at as being weak. But here Paul is calling them weak. Now, I've got a couple of videos on my channel where I go through all the references we have to the Essenes. Now, the only Jewish group that we have any evidence of that there was a group that did not eat meat were the Essenes. And all of our other sources praise the Essenes as being strong in faith, very pious, that even when they were under extreme torture, they would not blaspheme their lawgiver. Now, but Paul's calling these people weak in belief. And this is one reason why I said earlier that I believe that those who do not believe were not people that didn't believe in Yeshua. They were people who didn't believe in Paul's version of Yeshua. He said, he that eats, let him not despise him who does not eat. And he that does not eat, let him not judge he who eats, for Elohim received him. Who are you that judges another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. But he shall be made to stand, for Elohim is able to make him stand. One indeed judges one day and above another judges every day alike. Let each be completely persuaded in his own mind. He who minds the day minds it to Yahuwah, and he who does not mind the day to Yahuwah, he does not mind it. And he who eats to Yahuwah, for he gives Elohim thanks, and he who does not eat to Yahuwah, he does not eat, and gives Elohim thanks. So, to eat meat or not to eat meat. Paul is using this kind of like circular reasoning and this self-righteous type of grandstanding to basically, kind of poo-poo those people who were saying that we shouldn't eat meat. And he's encouraging people, you just, do whatever feels right, essentially. Notice also that here in around verse 5, there also seems to be an issue with the calendar. There's some kind of calendar dispute. Some people are, keeping certain days. Other people are keeping other days. So we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Essenes, whom I make the case that the Essenes were actually the early Nazarenes, that they kept this solar calendar versus the temple cult, which kept the moon calendar. And Paul, as an agent of the high priest, which calendar would he have kept? So, there's another group out there that's teaching people not to eat meat and to keep a different calendar. And Paul is basically saying, don't worry about it. You guys need to don't even worry about arguing this thing. And of course, a lot of Paul's followers, even today, use the same argument against people that keep the calendar that the Dead Sea Scrolls follows. So this is kind of setting the stage for Paul's differences against this other group. So, here, certain people judge certain days, other people don't. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's this character known as the Spouter of Lies, who, oddly enough, seems to line up in multiple ways with Paul. The Spouter of Lies, some people have even said it should be translated the boasting liar. Of course, Paul is always defending himself against two accusations, boasting and lying, all throughout his epistles. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Spouter of Lies attacks the teacher of righteousness. And from the details that are in the Damascus document, it appears that the boasting liar was able to apprehend the righteous teacher, because the righteous teacher was they went into the temple and took the righteous teacher captive on Yom Kippur, the day that the Yom Kippur that the teacher of righteousness was keeping, which was a different Yom Kippur than the Spouter of Lies and the wicked priests were keeping. And the belief is that if the Spouter of Lies is Paul, the wicked teacher, the wicked priest is Ananias, and the righteous teacher would have been James. Part of the controversy is that the righteous teacher was on a different calendar than the wicked priest. So again, you see further evidence of this calendar dispute. Moving on, it says, and I know I am persuaded in the Master Yeshua that none at all is common of itself. Everything is clean, right? Isn't that Paul's doctrine? But to him who regards whatever to be common, to him it is common. And if your brother is grieved because of your food, you are no longer walking in love. Do not by your food ruin the one for whom Messiah died. So who is Paul speaking to? Well, he's speaking to someone who is trying to hold these new believers to a higher standard of dietary choices. He says, do not then allow your good to be spoken of as evil. For the reign of Elohim is not eating and drinking, but righteousness and peace and joy in the set-apart spirit. Do not destroy the work of Elohim for the sake of food. All indeed are clean, but evil to that man who eats so as to cause stumbling. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine, nor to do whatever by which your brother stumbles. Do you have belief? Have it to yourself before Elohim. Blessed is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. But he who doubts, if he eats, is condemned, because it is not of belief. And all that is not of belief is sin. Okay, so what's he saying? Well, Paul's saying, do as thou wilt, do what you want. And you know what? It's good not to eat meat, but don't hold others to that. Don't teach other people not to eat meat. You just keep that to yourself. And don't cause someone else to stumble by teaching them what it's obvious that Yeshua taught them not to eat meat. That's the that's the only reason that all the apostles and all the Jewish Christian groups would keep this vegetarian diet. But as I read this, everything that Paul's saying here, I hear an echo of this constantly from people who propose to be believers, but at the same time they will not hear this message of refraining from eating meat. So even today, Paul's words are living on in the mouth of many people who continue to, despite the evidence, despite the stuff that I've shown, and the references we have, and the proof of it all through Scripture, that Elohim's desire was to keep a vegetarian, at the least a vegetarian diet. I can't for sure say that everyone was vegan. I'm not going to try and say that they were, but they certainly did not eat meat. You know, we see that in the first chapter of Genesis, and then we see it in the teachings and doctrines of Yeshua. So from Genesis to Yeshua, we have this desire of the Father for his people not to slaughter animals and eat them. But, you know, of course, the enemy always sends in his own agent, this time in the form of Paul, to keep the people from putting away the dead bodies of animals for food. So, just to further the point, in the Panarian chapter 18, this is the chapter that's speaking about the Ebionites. But it does mention James. It says, "And moreover, I found that he, James, was of Davidic descent because of being Joseph's son, that he was born a Nazarite, for he was Joseph's firstborn and consecrated. And I have found further that he also functioned as priest in the ancient priesthood." So the ancient priesthood would, of course, been the Essene priesthood. People hear the ancient priesthood and they think the Levites. Well, that wasn't the ancient priesthood. The ancient priesthood was Melchizedek. So James was a Melchizedekan priest. You know, what does Melchizedek mean? The righteous king. James himself, if Yeshua was a descendant of David, of course his brother James would also be a descendant of David. And he was born a Nazarite. Now, Nazarites did not drink wine. I also believe that they did not eat meat. But it goes on to say that James, the brother of the Lord, was holy from his mother's womb, and he drank no wine nor strong drink, nor did he eat flesh. And that's from Hegesippus, but it's quoted by Eusebius in his early church history. Now, Hegesippus lived in the 1st century, so he would have likely been had firsthand knowledge of James. If he didn't know James directly, he certainly had secondhand knowledge of him from people that did know James. So, from these two passages, we can see that James did not drink strong drink, did not eat wine, did not eat meat. And as far as the apostles in general, Eusebius in his book, The Proof of the Gospel, says to consider the character of the disciples of Yeshua. They persevered in a strenuous and laborious life with fasting and abstinence from wine and meat. So here's 2 witnesses, 3 witnesses if you count Hegesippus, that all say kind of the same thing. Romans 15:1, "But we who were strong," meaning the people that did eat meat, "but we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak being the people who eat only vegetables, and not to please ourselves. Let each one of us please his neighbor for his good and build him up. For even the Messiah did not please himself, but as it has been written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell upon me." So now, Paul's basically claiming equality with the Messiah. Not even the Messiah did this, because, he's comparing the people that are reproaching him as to the people that reproach the Messiah. So he's basically comparing the apostles to the people that killed Yeshua. Romans 16:17, "Now I call upon you, brothers, watch out for those who cause divisions and stumblings, contrary to the teaching which you have heard, and turn away from them, for such ones do not serve our Master Yeshua, but their own stomach, and by smooth words and flattering speech they deceive the hearts of the innocent." Again, very self-righteous. Of course, the people who are actually teaching Yeshua's doctrines, the apostles, they're the ones causing division. It's not Paul who's turning the people away from the Torah and creating his own lawless brand of teaching. He's not the one causing division. So also then we move into 1 Corinthians, since it is also written in between the incident at Galatians and Paul's trip into Jerusalem, the confrontation between him and James in Jerusalem. So for 1 Corinthians 1:10, Paul says, "And I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Master Yeshua, that you all agree and that there be no divisions among you." So now Paul's got divisions springing up in Corinth. He says, "For I have been informed concerning you that there are strifes among you. What I mean is this, that each one of you says, I am of Shaul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Kepha, or I am of Messiah." Okay, so now here we get a kind of a snapshot of this division, that there are some people claiming to be one of Paul's disciples, and then some are claiming to be Kepha's or Apollos. So, this division now that started in Antioch in the book of Galatians now is spread to Corinth. So who is Apollos? This is something very interesting, something I've glassed over before and never really thought a whole lot about. Apollos is also mentioned in Acts 18:24, and this is after Paul's second missionary journey, and either before or maybe at the very beginning of his third, when it says, "A certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, a learned man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus, and this one had been instructed in the way of the master. And being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching the matters about the master exactly, though he knew only the immersion of Yochanan, or John." Now, I'll tell you, every time I've read this, I never really slowed down and looked at it. I always thought that this was one of John's apostles. I just completely glossed over that part where it said that this one had been instructed in the way of the master. The master, of course, is Yeshua. So this was not John's apostle, but this is Yeshua's disciple, but he only knew the baptism of John, which indicates that Paul was teaching something different about the baptism. And it says, "He began to speak boldly in the congregation, and when Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of Elohim more exactly." Now, this is right after Paul met Aquila and Priscilla. And yet they're going to explain to this person, Apollos, who's also a disciple, who is fervent in spirit, and he's been instructed in the way of the master. So now you see that the people that are following Paul have a different doctrine than the people that are following the earlier apostles. And going on, verse 27, it says, "And when he intended to pass through Achaia, the brothers, having encouraged him, wrote to the taught ones to receive him who had arrived, greatly helped those who believed through favor, for with the power he refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures that Yeshua is Messiah." So this Apollos was not, he was not a slacker. He was a evangelist. But yet he didn't understand Paul's doctrine. He had been taught something different. "And it came to be, when Apollos was at Corinth, that Shaul, having passed through the upper parts, came to Ephesus, and having found some taught ones, he said to them, 'Did you receive the set-apart spirit when you believed?' And they said to him, 'No, we have not even heard that there is a set-apart spirit.' And he said to them, 'Into what were you immersed?' And they said, 'Into Yochanan's immersion.' And Shaul said, 'Yochanan indeed immersed with an immersion of repentance, saying to the people that they should believe in the one that is coming after him, that is, in Messiah, Yeshua. And when they heard this, they were immersed in the name of the Master Yeshua.'" Okay, so now, Paul is coming to Corinth, or I'm sorry, Apollos is in Corinth, and now Paul's coming to Ephesus right after Apollo left Ephesus. And so again, you see that Paul is teaching something different than Apollos. So then Paul baptizes them, and suddenly they get the Holy Spirit, but they didn't have the Holy Spirit when they get baptized by Apollos. But when some were hardened and did not believe, speaking evil of the way before the crowd, he withdrew from them and separated the taught ones, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannos. And this took place for 2 years, so that all who dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Master Yeshua, both Jews and Greeks. Okay, so a couple of things to point out here. Notice that there's this group who did not believe that were speaking evil of the way before the crowd. Now, the question is, are they speaking evil of what Paul is teaching or Yeshua himself? Because you don't see these people, people who don't believe, quote unquote, showing up when Apollos is teaching. It's only when Paul shows up. So I'm thinking that these are people that Apollos had instructed, and then Paul shows up and they realize that something's not right with Paul. And from this point on, it says that the word spread through all of Asia. Now, later on, we're going to see who it is in the temple that comes after Paul is the believers from Asia. So I think this word that went through all of Asia, which here in chapter 19 of Acts, Luke is trying to make it into a positive thing, but I think it's Paul's reputation is spreading among Asia, and people are starting to kind of catch on. In fact, toward the end of this third missionary journey, Paul doesn't even stop at Ephesus. He almost stops at Ephesus, but he says he's in too big of a hurry, so he goes right past Ephesus, and then he has the elders from Ephesus come over to him. It's almost like he was afraid to go to Ephesus itself. So 1 Corinthians 3, and I, brothers, was not able to speak to you as to spiritual ones, but as to fleshly, as to babes in Messiah. I fed you with milk and not with solid food. So Paul is now trying to explain to them why his doctrine was different than Apollos' doctrine. And so his excuse is that, well, you guys were not ready for the meat, which even this comparison would have been an abomination to the Nazareans, but Paul's using this, allegorical type of explaining to say that, I couldn't feed you meat. You were stuck on milk because you guys were not ready. So that's why Apollos seems to be teaching something different than me. I fed you with milk and not solid food, for until now you were not able to receive it. Even now you're still not able, for you are still fleshly. So it's the Corinthians' fault that he couldn't teach them the same thing that Apollos is teaching. For since there are envy and strife and divisions among you, are you not fleshly and walking according to a man? For when one says, I am of Shaul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not fleshly? What then is Apollos, and what then is Shaul, but servants through whom you believed, as master assigned to each? I planted, Apollos watered, but Elohim was giving growth. So then let no one boast in men, for all belongs to you, whether Shaul, or Apollos, or Kepha. Again, he's inserting Kepha in there, but Kepha's not even mentioned in Acts as having anything to do with Corinth. Or the world, or life, or death, or the present, or the future, all belongs to you, and you belong to Messiah, and Messiah belongs to Elohim. So, he's saying he couldn't teach the Corinthians the strong doctrine that Apollos was, because they were not ready, because they were forming divisions. But the funny thing is that the divisions now are springing up because he didn't teach. So see how he's kind of turning the tables on them. Well, it's obvious that you were not ready for it, because now you're causing all these divisions. So right now Paul's in damage control, I believe. He's trying to explain why there's a difference between him and Apollos. And I think that he's at least somewhat been exposed, and the Corinthians are starting to kind of question his motives. It says, let a man regard as servants of Messiah and trustees the secrets of Elohim. For the rest, it is sought in trustees that those should be found trustworthy. But with me, it is a small matter that I should be judged by you or by a man's court. But Not even myself I judge, for I am not conscious of any matter against myself. Yet I am not declared right by this, but he who judges me is Yeshua. So then he goes into this whole self-righteous spiel about how you shouldn't judge one another and all this other stuff. And he says, now some are puffed up as though I were not coming to you, but I shall come to you shortly if the master desires, and I shall know in the word of those who are puffed up, but the power. Okay, so here in verse 3, if any of you are doubting me that what I'm saying is correct, that Paul's actually, kind of trying to do damage control, here's the proof. He's being judged by the Corinthians. That's the purpose for his letter. That's why he's trying to smooth this over and make himself seem compatible with Apollos. And then in verse 18, he says that these people, presumably Apollos and Kepha, are saying that Paul's not even going to show up, that he's not even going to come back because he's been exposed. And Paul's saying, oh, they're just puffed up, I'm going to come back. But again, it highlights this division. So then, concerning the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol is no matter in all the world, and that there is no other Elohim but one. So remember the 4 prohibitions that were given to him by the Jerusalem assembly from the mouth of James himself. Number 1 was don't eat things sacrificed to idols, which of course is meat. Meat is always sacrificed to idols. I know sometimes grain is, but essentially the reason the Israelites were always involved in idolatry is because that's where you would go to be able to eat meat. You didn't just go and kill a lamb in your backyard or whatever. You would go to a temple, have the priest slaughter the lamb, and then you would share in part of the offering. So that's why they were always going to idols, was for the meat. Paul starts off here in chapter 8. Obviously, something's come to light about this meat sacrificed to idols. Somebody's found out that he's not teaching them to stay away from things sacrificed to idols. Verse 7, however, not all have this knowledge. So not everybody knows, like Paul does, that idols are not anything. Not all have this knowledge, but some, being aware of the idol until now, eat it as having been offered to an idol. So their conscience, being weak, is defiled. So see, these people that are telling us not to eat meat sacrificed to idols, they just have a weak conscience. They don't have faith. But food does not commend us to Elohim, for we are none the better if we eat, nor any worse for not eating. But look to it, lest somehow this right of yours has become a stumbling block to those who are weak. Now we know who those that are weak are. The people that are weak are the same ones that are eating vegetables. He's speaking about the Nazareans. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's place, shall not his conscience, if he is weak, be built up to eat food offered to idols? So this weak brother whom Messiah died, for whom Messiah died, shall perish through your knowledge. Now sinning in this way against the brothers and wounding their weak conscience, you sin against Messiah. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I shall never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So you see there at the end, in the bold, that's what's going on. This whole meat eating issue again comes up. Notice that Paul's saying, don't tell them that you can eat meat, or don't tell them that you can go to an idol. He's trying to, it's almost like he's trying to keep this doctrine from being exposed, that what he's teaching being exposed to the Jerusalem assembly. So he's like, yeah, well, when these guys come around, just act like you're taught to abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. Because you have this knowledge, but they don't have this knowledge because they're weak. They're weak in belief. 1 Corinthians 9:1. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Yeshua, Messiah, our Master? And are you not my work in the Master? If to others I am not an apostle, I certainly am to you. For you are the seal of my office, of the emissary in the Master, of the apostle in the Master. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a sister or wife, as to do also the other apostles and the brothers of the master and Kepha? Or do only Barnabas and I have no right to refrain from working? If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap material goods from you? Okay, so now you're getting some more of the accusations that's being levied toward Paul. There are people out there now that are saying that he's not an emissary. There are people out there that are questioning his status as an apostle. Notice the only person that calls Paul an apostle is Paul and the Gentiles that he's teaching. But now he's saying that the Gentiles are his proof of being an apostle. So somebody's asking for proof that he's an apostle. And someone else is criticizing him, or maybe it's the same group of people, but somebody's criticizing him because he's accepting material goods from the people that he's instructing. Of course, then he goes on a short rant about not to muzzle an ox not to muzzle an ox when it's treading the grain. And he says, does Elohim care about animals? Well, we know that he does. Yeshua says he does. Not a sparrow falls to the ground without the Father knowing it. But now Paul is misapplying that verse to justify him taking material goods from the people he's instructing. Of course, this is in direct opposition to what Yeshua taught, where he says, heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. You have received without paying, give without being paid. So it's in direct contrast with what Yeshua taught. 1 Corinthians 9:19, for though I am free from all, I made myself a servant of all, in order to win more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win the Jews. To those who are under Torah, as one under Torah, so as to win those under Torah. To those without Torah, as without Torah, not being without Torah toward Elohim, but under Torah of Messiah, so as to win those who are without Torah. To the weak I became as weak, so as to win the weak. To all men I have become all, so as to save some by all means. And I do this because of the good news, so as to become a fellow partaker with it. Okay, so you hear this being quoted all the time, but does anyone ever point out or notice that Paul's basically saying that he lies? He pretends to be, and let's focus on this, to the weak. Now we know who the weak are. The weak are the Nazarenes, according to Paul. To the weak I became as weak. So he pretended to be one of them. He's admitting it here. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. So when he was around the Jews, he acted like a Jew. When he was with the Gentiles, he acted like a Gentile. In my book, this is called lying. Misrepresenting yourself, or, being a hypocrite. The word hypocrite, of course, it means something different in English now. But what that word actually meant in the Greek in the first century is it meant an actor. Yeshua says, don't be like the actors who misrepresent themselves. And of course, you have Paul here telling you that he's an actor. He's a hypocrite. He's pretending to be something else. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. That's why he claims to be a Pharisee of Pharisees. The evidence indicates he's a Sadducee. Therefore, my beloved ones, flee from idolatry. What then do I say? That an idol is of any value, or what is offered to an idol is of any value? No, but what the Gentiles offer, they offer to demons, and not to Elohim. And I do not wish you to become sharers with demons. You are not able to drink the cup of the master and the cup of demons. You're not able to partake of the table of the master and the table of demons. Okay, so, you read this and you think, okay, well, Paul's on the right track now. You shouldn't eat things sacrificed to idols because you're basically inviting demons in. I mean, this is kind of what, along the same lines of what Kepha says in the Nazarene Acts. But then he goes on and tells them, you eat whatever is sold in the marketplace. Ask no questions because of conscience. For the earth belongs to Yahuwah and all that fills it. So it's like he does a 180. Like, I don't even understand how his thought process has any kind of logical, this means that here, because he makes a case for not eating meat sacrificed to idols because of demonology, and then he turns around and says, but just go ahead and eat whatever because everything belongs to Yahuwah, and if any of the unbelievers invite you and you wish to go, you eat whatever's set before you. Ask no questions on account of your conscience, and if anyone says to you this was offered to idols, then you don't eat it because of the one pointing it out to you. Not because it's offered to idols, but you don't eat it because of the one that pointed it out. And on account of the conscience, for the earth belongs to Yahuwah and all that fills it. Now I say conscience, not of your own, but that of the other. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of? For what I give thanks? Therefore, whatever you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the esteem of Elohim. Now, people in the Hebraic Roots movement, we try to, reinterpret what Paul's saying here, but it's pretty clear. Why is my freedom judged by another person? If I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of? For what I give thanks. So, it's obvious there's a group out here criticizing Paul. It's obvious that Paul's defending himself. Now, if this was some, outside group that was coming in and making these accusations toward Paul, would he need to write multiple letters to defend himself against these groups? If it was just a group of pagans coming in and trying to get the people to eat vegetarian, would he need to write all these letters? Who was coming in and telling the people not to eat with idols? And again, this appears to be, like I've said, we don't know exactly what happened between Paul and Peter, but it definitely has something to do with food, and it seemed to have something to do with the people, the Gentile believers, not being on the same page that Kepha thought they were originally. And I think that it's the same subject here. Kepha found out that the people were eating food that had been sacrificed to idols, and then he was sitting down to have a meal with them. And once that was exposed, that's why Kepha withdrew. And that's why he had the argument between Paul and Kepha and John Mark. Okay, so that's the end of this video. We'll come back again and we'll go briefly through some of Paul's other epistles. And then the video after that, we'll probably go ahead and get into where you have this confrontation between Paul and James. So thank you for listening. Shalom, and have a good evening.